Welcome to the Check-In, a podcast by the Telos Group on the Telos channel. The Check-In is a semi-regular conversation amongst the Telos team and guest experts, where we explore the headlines from Israel, Palestine, and across the world, wading into the complexity of seemingly intractable conflict to discover the power of peacemaking to heal us, our community, and our world. This is your host, David, checking in from Washington, D.C. Over the weekend, more than 100 students were arrested at Columbia University for participating in a Gaza solidarity protest, which, according to the administration, impeded the functioning of the university and created an environment that was unsafe for Jewish students. The protesters had begun camping out on a demarcated lawn on the university's grounds, and were later joined by others who were not students of the university, as Columbia President Manoush Shafiq testified before Congress on accusations that Columbia was not doing enough to combat anti-Semitism on campus. After students received notification of their suspension, university administrators called the NYPD to campus, which resulted in the arrests. Students at other major universities, including Harvard, Yale, NYU, and others, began camping out on their campuses as well in solidarity. We're here to discuss this with the team, what happened at Columbia, what it says more broadly about the state of free speech and campus safety here in the States, and how we can lead as peacemakers with a vision of our work where no one is left behind in the pursuit of justice and peace. All right, joining us today, we have Sarah.
Good morning from Minnesota.
And we have Greg.
Good morning from Charlottesville, Virginia.
Greg, you are an adjunct faculty at Columbia University, and Columbia was in the news this weekend after more than 100 students were arrested after demonstrating on campus. Walk us through what happened this weekend.
Well, this has been brewing for a long time. Shortly, what happened this weekend, though, is that students had set up an encampment last week on one of the laws, a Gaza solidarity encampment. This happened when President Manoush Shafiq went to Congress to testify in front of a committee about allegations of unchecked anti-Semitism on campus. She got back from those hearings Wednesday. Then she sent an email to a lot of students telling them that they were suspended. And she used the suspensions as a vehicle to invite the NYPD in because they're on their campus, right? And you can talk about breaking the rules, observing the rules, whatnot, but there wasn't actually any criminality involved until she issued that email. And 15 minutes later, the NYPD came into campus, and now these were technically criminal trespassers. Their cards no longer worked. They were notified they had 15 minutes to get their belongings out of their dorms, and more than 100 students were taken to jail. And that sparked a real uproar. There'd been a lot of division on campus. You know, as you mentioned, I'm just an adjunct professor. So if you don't know what that means like I'm not on tenured faculty. I don't really get paid much money at all. But I'm not really part of campus life because I have a full-time life outside of Columbia, but I come in a few hours a week, one semester to help teach a class called Covering Religion at the Graduate School of Journalism. So, you know, I haven't been like sort of like my pulse on what's happening at Columbia, but there had been a lot happening, which I think we need to talk about. And after those arrests, you know, the faculty, which had been divided for many months, and the students were really horrified both by President Shafiq's testimony and by just the way in which she brought into the police, into the campus community, and felt that it was a breach of trust. And so tensions just ratcheted up. Students came back. I went up the next morning. I didn't have the full history of everything that had been happening, from administration perspective, from a student perspective, but as one of the few Palestinian professors there, with students showing up ostensibly for human rights and putting their reputations, their educations, their bodies on the line, I felt I at least had to show up. So I went the past couple days before I had to get on the road for work and talked with some of the students and faculty. And I've been there and heading back to New York today, and I'm going to go back.
help us understand what exactly these students were protesting for. I mean, you said it was a Gaza solidarity protest, but there's a lot of conversation, especially in the media across the spectrum, of what these students, the postures that they were doing these protests in, what exactly they were advocating for. Do you have a sense for that? Can you help us understand what exactly it is that they were advocating for?
Yeah, well, the protesters now have a couple pretty clear demands. They want to end the suspensions, one, which have consequences. Graduation is just around the corner, and a lot of the students were set to graduate. But more importantly, they're focused on the situation in Gaza. Colombia has a $3.5 billion endowment. That's a lot of money, right? And that money keeps on growing. And the money keeps on growing in part because of donations, but because of investments, really. And so Columbia University, a lot of our elite universities, they have a lot of money invested in companies, and we don't always know what those companies are. So the first demand that the student protesters wanted is they wanted transparency. And the second demand is they want divestment. They want the university, which has all these resources, to pull any investments out of companies like weapons manufacturers that they see as complicit into what the ICJ and much of the world sees now as a plausible case of genocide. So the core demand is about the issue that the students feel is ignored. I think a lot of what we see about in the media, and something I think we really need to talk about too, are allegations of anti-Semitism. That some of the chants and some of the tactics have been aggressive. That many Jewish students feel unsafe, which is true for part of the Jewish community at Columbia and elsewhere. And so, it's getting at sort of the line between free speech and anti-Semitism, legitimate forms of protest, but the core demands really come back to human rights and to Gaza, and there's a lot more context here too that I can tell you about that you haven't seen in the media, that relates not just to anti-Semitism, but to this administration's weaponization of anti-Semitism, and by this administration I mean the Columbia administration's weaponization of it, as well as this administration's complete and utter disregard for Palestinian, Arab, Muslim students, for the faculty, for people like me, for our perspectives, for our safety. You may not know, DCAT and Sarah, I want to ask you this. Do you know that many Columbia students were actually hospitalized after they were attacked with a chemical weapon, a banned chemical weapon on January 19th? I happened to be there that day too. So I have something to say about that. And I bet, well, you're nodding your heads. Our listeners can't see that. You're nodding your heads up and down that, yes, you heard about that. But I didn't. I don't think many of our listeners know about this incident, which targeted Jewish, Palestinian, and other students who were in support of human rights for Palestinians. And so I want to talk a little bit about that incident because I think that's an interesting way into to understand what's happening on the lawn now.
Before you do that, Greg, and I think that's a super important incident to bring up. I so appreciate you giving all this context. And there's just a little bit I want to add too that I think is important for people to remember when we think about campuses. Administrations absolutely have a duty to keep students safe, but to me, that extends to all students, right? Jewish students, Palestinian students, Muslim students, Arab students. And I'll just own this is my opinion. The way Columbia as an administration has responded has fed into that us versus them kind of scarcity mentality that tries to push back against this idea that you can be both against anti-Semitism and for human rights, especially Palestinian human rights. And the more of that scarcity mindset that's out there, the more students are pitted against each other. And as we know, right, from watching the solidarity movement, the Palestinian solidarity movement on Columbia's campus, on campuses across the country, there's a large Jewish student solidarity movement as well that's in relationship, that is part of this. And the silencing of those voices, right, the co-opting of one Jewish identity to kind of legitimize shutting down free speech and dissent is really harmful and to me disingenuous to the agency that those other Jewish students have. And that's not at all to invalidate the legitimate fears some Jewish students have around anti-Semitism. Again, everyone deserves to feel safe on campus. But administration should be setting that tone for how to lead a better conversation and lead better actions to make sure that all students are safe and supported and, literally not kicked out of their dorms and made kind of homeless in New York City. And we know that that's possible, right? We know that combating anti-Semitism and advocating for Palestinian human rights is not opposed. They go hand in hand. And to see so many institutions, not just Columbia, but not just fail to uphold that, but to really pit students against each other, to me completely, goes the wrong direction against the kind of space universities could be.
Well, Sarah, I need to, I mean, this is an important conversation too, because I need to jump in and say something. And I feel awkward saying this as a Palestinian. However, this is truth. First, that a lot of these tactics are actually helping to fuel real anti-Semitism. And this is not to blame the victim. This is to blame the cynical committee, Stefanik, this representative who doesn't care about Jewish or Palestinian lives. She just cares about her power. This is to blame Shafiq, Minouche Shafiq, the current president of Columbia University, who will not last, and the board of trustees, who again are seeing anti-Semitism as a political issue to, ally themselves with certain forces who are decrying anti-Semitism and against the real battle of anti-Semitism. As we know, anti-Semitism functions and presents itself in a variety of ways. There are these anti-Semitic tropes out there which have been used time and time again to delegitimize the humanity of Jewish people and to destroy and cage entire communities, right? And these tropes include things about Jewish control of media, Jewish power, these Jewish cabals that are like pulling the strings everywhere. And these heavy-handed tactics that are quelling actual free speech, actual students it's so incredible. I know some of these students, these are the most brilliant people you will ever meet. These people are doing what we are all trying to do right now, which is to live out our values in the public square in the face of something truly impossible. What we see happening right now is that these heavy-handed tactics of just trying to shut down actual people of integrity are really backfiring, and it's not forming new anti-Semites. What it is doing is it is giving incredible fodder, fuel to anti-Semitic forces out there who are trying to say, look, we told you so. And it's not true. There are no Jewish cabals. There is no Jewish control of media. There are some wealthy donors who happen to have a certain view of anti-Semitism to Columbia University who've been outsized in their voice. But look, their voice is obviously not carrying the day right now. And what is so horrible about this is everybody's looking to protect their positions, except for these students on the lawn, right? Some of whom have made chants, but particularly people from outside of our community who have done things which are anti-Semitic, which we have to resist and name. And so I'm not trying to sweep that aside. As you say, Sarah, we have to fight for human rights alongside combating anti-Semitism. And I would say the struggle against anti-Semitism, or the struggle for Jewish liberation, is a struggle for Palestinian liberation too. And that's something that we can talk about. These struggles are coextensive and complementary. They should not be opposed to one another. But what we see right now is the absolute weaponization of these forces. And the result is that it is giving absolute fuel to these forces. That's what's happening now, and that's terrifying. And our political leadership continues to play right into this. I mentioned there was what was plausibly a terrorist attack on Columbia's campus. Silence. Our administration had one email about that. Congressional hearing, we can't talk about an ongoing investigation from January. More than a dozen students sought hospitalization, hospital treatment, right? And silence. President Biden has a couple tweets from people, and he gets out to condemn these protesters when there's a long history right here that we actually need to talk a little bit more about.
Greg, what you're saying is so important. And it also makes me think about two of our practices of peacemaking, that self-interrogation goes hand in hand with advocacy. And I think, right, all of us, that's one of our practices. All of us have the potential to both do harm, but also do good in our communities. And where we have unique access and relationship, we can lovingly call people in to a better way of advocating. And I think about, the students I know on campuses across the country who are doing this work, who might encounter folks who don't know that a particular slogan or statement or position might veer into anti-Semitism, who call them into a better collective liberation way of advocating, who don't let that go unchecked, but do it from a posture of believing that most people don't want to do harm, and that, we don't always know the waters we're swimming in. And doing it that way, right? Approaching it from, hey, here's a loving correction so that your liberation work can be more inclusive and not be us versus them, versus shutting it down and looking for those detractors or looking for those handful of agitators or students or even just unintentional statements that do cross that line. The way we choose to show up and respond to people can either invite people into this deeper work that recognizes that combating anti-Semitism and advocating for Palestinian human rights goes hand in hand, or that furthers that binary division. And I'd say none of us who are on this call or listening to this call respond very well when people, yell at us or shut us down or are looking for reasons to disagree with us. But when people are invited to see the way that they might have unintentionally done harm in their pursuit of trying to do good, I think people do want to change and do want to do it in a way that leads to more, peace and justice, but then also reconciliation. And I think that's the invitation for me, for all of us on this call too, is to think about how do we invite people into the kind of movement and work we want to see without looking for reasons to put them out on the doorstep or detract from them.
It reminds me of the work of listening to understand too, this first practice of peacemaking, and how many of us can often look at, someone across from us on a political aisle or some other kind of difference and jump to a kind of condemnation that they are the problem, right? It's their perspectives, it's their postures, it's their actions. But really, we must ask ourselves, as the work of self-interrogation invites us to, how we started with listening, how we begun by hearing. What are their core values? What are they actually asking for? What is their posture towards this issue? And can I find room for agreement or collaboration with these communities in the midst of this? As you were inviting us into, Greg, there's some deeper considerations or demands from these protesters that I think are worth hearing, right? Given the moment that we are in which 34,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza. Millions are starving, right? There's a sense of urgency. Can we hear what they're crying for, and recognizing the way in which they're inviting us to encounter our implication as Americans in, what you named and recognized as what the ICJ has called a plausible genocide, right? And, Sarah, what you're inviting us to is, yes, we can consider the ways we do that work and, the ways that we advocate and protest or whatever it is, but we have to start with just listening. And I think that's a particularly important invitation, considering what's happening in Congress right now, right? As you mentioned, Greg, President Shafiq was a part of a congressional hearing about what's been happening on campus. This came after a series of other hearings with 3 other university presidents from Harvard, the University of Pennsylvania, and MIT. Those went horribly, right? So, and these leaders, frankly, aren't doing that work. They're not really actually trying to listen. And it raises questions also of free speech in this country. What are the limits of that? What does that look like? Is it being protected? Is it not? Can you open up the conversation a bit for us, Greg, into this larger work around what's happening in Congress, how it relates to free speech, anti-Semitism, and what you have named as anti-Palestinianism, or a bias against Palestinians, Muslims, or other Arabs?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to do that. I want to sort of hold what you said about the importance of listening, and I think part of what we see on Columbia's campus is that there has been no listening, and there was no listening before October 7th. And I've said this very clearly to the administration, to the provost's office, to a group of faculty, as well as to J School adjunct faculty. And so I hear you wanting to talk about Congress and all of this, like Congress, lots of posturing. There's no combating anti-Semitism there, or with the Columbia's administration, there's just weaponization of it. But when you talk about listening, there wasn't really any listening going on for a long time. I co-teach a class called Covering Religion. So how do journalists write about religion for largely secular audiences? Our media does a terrible job of that. It just caricatures or ignores, doesn't even understand how faith communities interact with the issues of the day, how they shape them, and when it does report on these trends, does a terrible job. My co-professor is a man named Ari Goldman. He was New York Times religion reporter for a number of years, for more than 2 decades, and we've been teaching this class together for 5 years, and we have very different views on Zionism. So the thing that I wanted to share is, like, we've always been sort of like these little bit of outsiders in this conversation, because nobody wanted to talk about Israel-Palestine before October 7th. we all knew where this was headed, right? And we knew that to actually have a real conversation about an issue that's fraught, that affects all of us so deeply, that we are implicated in. Columbia University has investments in weapons manufacturers, for example, and you see the parade, the charade in Congress, which is just shameful. I mean, it's beyond shameful, right? If we're going to be honest right now. And you see the failure of our government at every level to enact in a way which actually promotes and protects Palestinian and Israeli life, much less U.S. interests. I mean, we're almost 7 months in, and Hamas is not defeated. The ideology is stronger. Just as we said 7 months ago, hostages haven't been returned. Couple exceptions, except for in a deal. Gaza is decimated, and right now, like West Bank, deadliest days in the West Bank. While we're talking about anti-Semitism on campus, a Shifa hospital, emerges and evidence of mass atrocities there that nobody's talking about. Hundreds of people slaughtered potentially. Those need to be confirmed. But my point being, DCAT, is that this stuff didn't happen overnight. These protests didn't happen overnight. They happened because there were failures of the Columbia University to actually manage its mission as an educational institution. The journalism school where I teach, we had our class, but didn't want to touch this. I think they did a better job in recent months, but especially after October 7th, didn't want to listen to understand. They didn't want to create an educational environment. And if we can't have these conversations at a university, one of the supposedly premier universities in the world, if we can't train journalists to cover these stories and deeply understand the movements and the people and the influences, what kind of society do you end up with? Look at Congress. Of course, this is the Congress we went up with. If our educational system is so afraid of creating people who are courageous enough to ask tough questions, to lean in, to have uncomfortable conversations, to go places where we don't necessarily feel safe. And one of those places that you referenced, DCAT, is understanding Palestinians as equal human beings. There's this thing called anti-Palestinianism or anti-Palestinian racism or hate, whatever you want to call it. It's similar to anti-Semitism. We talked a little bit about anti-Semitism earlier and all of these anti-Semitic tropes which exceptionalize or devalue or fetishize Jewish people based on their Jewishness. See them as other, as less than. The same is true for Palestinians. I mean, often Palestinians don't exist. We're an invented people, unless we're terrorists. Or Palestinians are always angry and they have these demands. And well, if they just would accept peace and just get along, Palestinians, well, it's weird that they're attached to their land, but well, Jewish people, who were connected from 3,500 years ago, of course they have this attachment to the land. Where my family, members of my extended family who were kicked out of their actual homes that they lived in for generations still have the keys to, the village. They're crazy for feeling that they were wronged. There are all of these ways that anti-Palestinianism manifests itself in this idea that somehow Palestinian stories and perspectives and experiences, they just don't matter as much, or we're just violent and we're just argumentative, and if we could just get over it, and if our problem, and we're inherently anti-Semitic. That's sort of like the charge of the Palestinian people, that somehow any speech that talks about Palestinian freedom, Palestinian refugees simply saying, I want to go back to my home, my village, or I miss my home or village, somehow that is construed by some falsely as anti-Semitic. And so there is this thing called anti-Palestinianism that nobody wants to pay any attention to. People don't want to pay attention to Palestinians. It's an uncomfortable fact for many supporters of Israel that the majority of Palestinians were kicked out of their homes around the creation of the state of Israel and not allowed to return because of who they are. It was a Jewish majority state. We understand, of course, the drive towards Zionism and Jewish nationalism. But you also have to understand the drive for Palestinians to simply survive and maintain these communities that they love, that they're connected to, and to be reconnected to them. And to say that somehow that desire for freedom is racist, to conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, is actually racist in itself. And so when we're talking about these struggles actually being complementary, we need to remember that Nakba, the Palestinian catastrophe, which began but did not end, in 1947 started after Holocaust. These traumas are intimately connected. And many of the forces that have oppressed Jewish people historically are similar forces, similar ideologies that are used to devalue Palestinians today. And there is no good future for anyone in Israel, Palestine, for anyone there, unless there's a good reality for everyone. So this comes back to fundamental human rights. And so I know our listeners might be listening to this rant and say, hey, Greg, what are you talking about right here? What I'm talking about is that fundamental human rights matter. This is the way out. This is the way not just to combat anti-Semitism and anti-Palestinianism, but to center the value of all human beings, Israeli, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, atheist, whatever. This is the North Star that we have to work for, that we have to lock our arms for. And there are some real missteps happening around Colombia, particularly from outside agitators, but including some members of our own community there. Anti-Semitism, the struggle against it should be my struggle too, as a human being, but also as a Palestinian, right? But I'm seeing the seeds of something remarkable sprouting there. I'm seeing the seeds of something truly remarkable that is spreading elsewhere, despite the attempts from our politicians and some in our media to continually weaponize these hate crimes for their own power and their own advantage, which is repulsive. It's another form of anti-Semitism and anti-Palestinianism, right? What we're seeing the seeds of a beautiful movement of co-liberation, of people being awakened to the fact that human rights still matters and that they have agency, and they're going to try and use that agency. And while we prefer to be talking about what's happening on Israel in Gaza right now and the West Bank and Jerusalem, like right now, we're in our own communities right now and saying, hey, no, these things matter. And so, Sarah, as you say, I think this is a real learning opportunity for all of us on this call. And you may have views about protests and rule breaking. I want you to understand there was a lot of rule breaking going on. Those students that I talked to you about earlier, when I was there, who were the subject, they were attacked by a chemical weapon and completely ignored because they were talking about Palestinian human rights, right? And so their views didn't matter. Those stories didn't matter. Like we can just stay in these stories, which we can't ignore. People have to be accountable. Or we can say, hey, wait a second, there's something also beyond accountability right now. And it's going to be messy right now because we've been so involved in promoting human rights violations for so long. And this is a beautiful beginning. And on Monday, I wasn't there because I had to come away for work. I would have been there. Hundreds of Columbia faculty walked out, whether they agreed with the administration's position on Gaza or not. They agreed that academic freedom, free speech, forming citizens who stand up for their values is truly important, and inviting the police into our community, which was unnecessary and unwarranted, was not the way to do that.
That's so important, Greg. And I want to raise that point too about the importance of protecting the ability to resist nonviolently. Nonviolence is one of our other principles, right? That nonviolence is creative and clear resistance to injustice. And to me, that's what 90%, right? 99% of the student protesters are doing. And that doesn't mean that when we look at it, nonviolent resistance always looks like we'd like it to look. But if we're serious, all of us on this call, if we're serious about promoting nonviolent resistance to injustice, creative and clear actions that draw attention to violence, that call us out, call us into question, force issues in front of our eyes that we might not want to be seeing, right? There's fatigue around advocacy. Then we have to protect people's ability to do that. Because when people have no hope or belief that nonviolent resistance actually can lead to transformation, then that's when they resort to violence. And so I think that that's a really important lens on this too, is, right, students might be breaking rules, they might be disrupting, but to me, that is really creative resistance to what they see as injustice. And protecting that, promoting that, encouraging folks to engage, even as we invite them to self-interrogate and ensure that there isn't unintentional anti-Semitism in some of that. Protecting that ability is essential. It's not just, we pay lip service to nonviolence. No, we have to protect ways for people to actually be able to live that out in really creative countercultural ways.
I think that's exactly right. And that calls also with calling out real instances of both anti-Palestinianism and anti-Semitism, which have happened on our campus and elsewhere. But I want our listeners to understand one thing, because I see what people are saying about these protests and the students and rule breaking. I want them to understand that this is symptomatic of a problem that goes back many years. This did not happen overnight. A divorce, in most instances, does not happen overnight. There are these untended to currents, and students were actively ignored. Faculty actively ignored, not just since October 7th, but before. I'm speaking from personal experience here. Nobody wanted to touch this. They just wanted to keep pushing it under the rug. And there's a responsibility there. If you're in a position of power, and your community deeply cares about something, it's going to go sideways. It's not that the students are going to stop talking about this. It's not that faculty are going to stop caring. And that's what we're seeing right now. And so the fact that it's going sideways by people who are driven by values, who are not like, they're not preventing other students from studying. There have been instances of that, but these are students on a demarcated area in the lawn. People can walk, go to class. It's not incredibly disruptive. But what you're saying here is that right to protest is fundamental to democracy. But the protest itself is symptomatic of democracy and our institutions failing. In this case, our educational institution and our political institutions. That's what's happening right now. If our institutions, it's not just random people wanting to tear down the government. These people have very clear demands. Some of them are trying to be co-opted by others, but the massive energy right now is to say freedom of speech matters. The massive energy of the protests themselves is to say that all human life matters. And right now, we are complicit in the devaluing of Palestinian life, which isn't going anywhere good for anyone in Israel-Palestine. So I want to be very clear as we're looking at this lens. If you're just looking what happened the last 2 days, you're missing the story. You're missing the story. And so what we need to understand right here is that sometimes these ruptures are necessary, and these ruptures are also inevitable when our institutions and our leaders stop listening to legitimate concerns. Here, these are concerns for fundamental human rights. And so listening to understand is something that we can do, but protesting is a way to get those who refuse to listen because it shakes their position of power. It's a way to force them to listen. And sometimes it's not pleasant, but sometimes this is necessary, and it's a whole lot better than actual violence, which we should never condone against civilians.
I think that's a powerful reminder for us, Greg, that there's so much more listening to be done right now, but even to look back and ask the question, how did we get here? What did we miss? What were we not hearing? Who were we not listening to along the way? Because this matters for us. As we're seeing what's happening in Israel, Palestine doesn't stay there. It comes into our communities because our communities, folks from our communities are part of, the Jewish community. They're Palestinian, they're Muslim, they're Arab American, right? These are our neighbors, right? This matters to them. This is a core part of who they are and their story. And so if we continue to ignore their stories and what they're asking for and crying out for, it's going to bubble up to the surface, right? And we have to ask the question, as you did, Greg, what kind of society do we want to live in? What kind of world do we want to live in? Do we want to live in a world where people are left behind, where people's dignity isn't honored, where the humanity of every single person isn't equal? Or do we want to live in a society and in a world where everyone is brought with us into co-liberation, as you're saying, into mutual flourishing? Do we want to live in a world where American power is expressed in ways that actually promote flourishing, rather than promote what we're seeing right now, right? In destruction, in famine, in death, right? We need this vision. We need this vision of justice that isn't just a turning of the tables, right? And caring, for giving power to the people who have been on the underside of oppression, but actually building a new table where everyone can belong and have equal ownership, right? That's what we want to build.
And DCAT, I want to say, I want all our listeners to pay attention to what happened last night, Monday night, the first night of Passover at Columbia's campus and elsewhere. You talk about a table. Passover is the Jewish celebration or commemoration of the Jewish people's freedom from slavery, from enslavement in Egypt. And there are these Seder dinners which commemorate the story. And there was a Seder, Solidarity Seder with more than 100 Jewish students on the lawn right there. That's a movement I want to be a part of. That's a movement we all want to be a part of. And so as we're feeling this deep discomfort as we read and watch the news, and as we know it's being manipulated to try and get us to feel a certain way, I want to manipulate you to feel another way. I want you to look at this as a beautiful opportunity of the possibility of what could be. And this is within all of our grasp. And to understand that these students are truly such a bright hope in an irredeemable moment. This moment is not something that we can ever reconcile, right? I mean, look at what's happening in Gaza and Israel and what's about to happen elsewhere. It is disastrous. I am a person of very weak faith. I don't know what to do with faith or any of these things. They're just so beyond me when I'm faced with the horrors of the moment. And right now, what's giving me faith are these students risking their futures to model a different kind of table. And if this is the future of America, wow, these ideals that have been exposed to be potentially hypocritic and problematic might be something we actually can live into together. So look on these protests with a gaze of hope and be inspired. Say, how can I become part of that table too?
Folks, continue to build those tables. Continue to move in your communities, engage with your elected officials who are doing this work in ways that are sidelining the very people with whom we have to live our future, right? Our neighbors. Engage with your faith leaders, engage with your family and your friends, and invite them to the table, build this new table such that all of us can have room to flourish alongside of each other. That's our work in this moment. It's so essential. It's urgent. Keep it up. Thanks for listening, folks. Continue to rate and review our show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Follow us on social media. We'd love to hear from you. Reach out. See you next time.